The U.S.-led coalition is launching new airstrikes in the fight against ISIL terrorists. The focus remains on Kobane, but it's not keeping ISIL from pushing deeper into the Syrian town just steps away from Turkey. We'll have a live report from Turkey later on in our newscast. But first, we want to get more perspective if these airstrikes are working. We want to go right now to Istanbul, and for more perspective is Professor Gulnur Aybet. She's a professor of international relations and political science at Bahcesehir University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
You mentioned that the government, there has been a lot of reaction in Turkey from both sides of this. ISIL continues to gain more and more ground of Kobane. We've been hearing it, that it can fall at any day. How close is it to falling it, and what would it mean?
Well, I mean, I think, that they're getting pretty close and the fighting has been intensifying. But at the same time, there was talk about a couple of days ago that it was imminent that it would fall. But I guess the Kurdish fighters inside the town are holding out a little longer than everybody thought, because once in the town, of course, you're talking about street-to-street fighting, and that changes the situation. But yes, they have made very heavy advances.
I'd like to get your take on the no-fly zone and the buffer zone that Turkey is proposing, and explain to our international audience what that means and what they want to get out of it.
Well, Turkey at the moment is hosting more than 1.5 million refugees from Syria and Iraq. And just in the past few weeks, because of the situation in Kobane, Turkey's taken in another 200,000 refugees from the villages around Kobane. So it's a huge social and economic burden, and Turkey's been putting up that burden all by itself without any help from the international community. And as you can imagine, there are more people stranded on the border, as there are very large spaces where there's no governance in both countries, which leads to a rise to groups like ISIL. So what Turkey is proposing is immediately, for two reasons. First of all, the safety of the people who are already trapped, the ability to be able to take back some of the people in Turkey and keep them safe and maintained that way, and also to protect the Turkish border, which is getting more and more dangerous by the minute. So for those two reasons, they proposed a safe area across the border and a no-fly zone to be able to enforce it. Now, the other partners in the coalition have not been that enthusiastic in their support of this. And there are also several difficulties with the proposal itself, because to maintain a reasonable safe area, it needs to be demilitarized, as we saw in the cases in Bosnia. And to do that, you probably would be safer to get a UN resolution and have it established by the UN. But given Russian objections to any intervention, and Iranian as well, there are regional repercussions in aiming for this. But I think it's also very unrealistic to expect Turkey to go across the border and put boots on the ground as the only member of the coalition and take an enormous risk and possibly get dragged into a longer prolonged war in the region. So I think it's very unrealistic to expect Turkey to do anything more than it's doing right now.
Well, I want to ask you about that because, the outside world sees some backlash against Turkey with what they think is inaction. What do the majority of Turks inside the country think? Do they feel that the government is making the right decision? Do they support what's happening at the moment?
There are mixed feelings. I mean, but I would think that despite the clashes we've had on the streets in cities closer to the border, largely Kurdish-populated areas where there's Kurdish resentment among Kurdish groups over what's going on across the border. And a lot of these clashes have actually been between rival Kurdish groups as well. So let's just remind ourselves of that as well. And so with all of this, despite all of this going on, I think a majority of the people, regardless of whether they support the government or are critical of the government, would be very wary of any military intervention, because there's going in there without a long-term strategy, and or a clear exit strategy, I think would be madness at this stage. And everybody feels that. And Turkey is the only country in the region that has such a long border with Syria and with Iraq, in both places where ISIL is active at the moment. So, I mean, other members of the coalition, I think they feel, they need to do something. And yes, airstrikes in the short run have a limited effect, but everybody seems to be interested in a quick fix solution for the time being without really thinking it through for the long term. And Turkey would really like to see something more concrete in terms of a long-term solution, because they're the ones that have to stay here with this very long border. And that's why Turkey's put forward the other aspect of the Syrian settlement, and possibly without the Assad regime. But there you have another tricky position, because in the short run, if you are going to establish a safe area or a buffer zone with UN blessing, without any objections from Russia and Iran, you have to do it in the short term with the approval of the Assad regime, and that's not going to happen. So, I mean, especially if you today. President Obama's special envoy to deal with ISIL, General Allen's been in Ankara since yesterday. And today they agreed that Turkey would take on some of the training and equipping of the Free Syrian Army, or what's left of it. But I mean, once you put yourself in that position again, you're putting yourself in a very clear camp against the Assad regime, and you have two countries in the region that are supporting the Assad regime to stay. So this makes things very difficult. But in the short run, I think it's madness to accept Turkey to do anything unilaterally.
A very complicated situation indeed. Professor Aybet, thank you so much for joining us from Istanbul.
Thank you.